Hello, my name is Andrew Doherty and I'm from Cheek Point. And as part of the Bealtaine Festival, I've agreed to read a couple of sections from my book, Before the Tide Went Out. It's a memoir of growing up in Cheek Point in County Waterford and what it was like when it was a salmon fishing village, or a fishing village. So the first piece I'm going to read is chapter 4, Working Ryan's Shore, which is the piece of shoreline that stretches from Cheek Point down almost as far as Passage East. And I'm just reading a part from it. But it wasn't all fishermen on the shore. In those days it was a mecca for young and old, men and women, fisher folk and non-fisher folk. In the summer, crowds of giggling teens walked along to swim at the Barn Quay. While we waited for the tide to be right, we would skim stones across the surface of the river, and the winner was the person with the most hops in one throw. The stones there were perfect because it was once used as an embarkation point for two slate quarries which are now overgrown and forgotten in the hills. Damaged slate was discarded onto the beach while intact slate was loaded onto lighters for transport to town. The enterprise failed because it was not cost effective, the trade in slate between Wales and Waterford being then well established. But the remains of the quarrymen's work were in abundance, and you never had to look far for the perfect skimmer. We also fished for crabs off the point, using the mussels that grew in abundance on the rocks for bait. Another activity was to hunt for baby eels, elvers, under the moss-covered rocks that could always be found where freshwater streams ran into the river. We also hunted for bottles. Those days they came in on the tide in two categories: bottles that could be smashed and bottles that had a returnable deposit which you were paid for when you brought them back to the local shops. The most trouble was caused when we gathered up the worthless ones and lined them up for a bazzing, as we called it. We would step back an agreed distance and then gather up as many stones as we could hold, and on the command "go" we would begin to throw. The winner was the one with the most broken bottles to his credit. In those days though, you had to be careful where you smashed them. Any fisherman ripping his sailboats on broken glass was liable to come looking for you. As the shore was south facing, it could become a sun trap, particularly in northerly wind, and consequently it was a popular walk and a popular spot for beachcombing. My grandmother, Maura Moran, spent a lot of her time down there, and this was principally because it was a good source of firewood. Everyone gathered driftwood in those days, and people had their own piles where they gathered firewood to a special spot, standing it to dry and easier to come back and collect. As you walked the strand, you would stand up each piece you wanted. Standing it did two things: drying it obviously, but it also denoted that it wasn't just a piece of driftwood anymore. No, now it was claimed. Driftwood washes up all the time, you see, but it never stands itself up. A second piece, a stood up piece was claimed and woe-betide anyone to touch another's. I remember some fairly fierce rows in the Mount Avenue in days gone by when someone with a pile of sticks on their back tried to get past with someone else's timber. If the timber was too big to stand, it could be tied, but it had to be tied to a fixed object like a rock or a tree. The wood piles tended to be located close to a laneway or a quayside, somewhere accessible and identifiable with a family. Nanny kept her main pile at Moran's poles just below the Russian side. It wasn't just timber, it might be buckets, balls, buoys, cans, rope, twine, bits of netting. They tended to gather up anything in those days, and of course the impending epidemic of plastic was only starting. Many were the expeditions I made with a hammer and a screwdriver to collect precious boat nails or other fittings that washed up attached to flotsam. Nanny was constantly lamenting the fact that people threw away such good stuff, all of which she could see a use for. One evening I arrived home from fishing to spot a mug sitting on the kitchen table. It was distinctive in colour and was being used as a promotional gimmick by the L&N grocery chain featuring a dog called Lenny. Puzzled, I asked Nanny where it had come from. hoping it wasn't what I had seen for weeks, filled with seaweed, rushes, stagnant water, and dead sandhoppers embedded in the strand. But alas, I wasn't mistaken. Sure, wasn't it a perfectly fine mug, my grandmother said. Who would cast such a thing? Next day she was having a hot cup out of Lenny after steeping it overnight. For many years after she was gone from us, I used it myself. As Nanny grew frailer, she gathered clippings, as she called them, small pieces of driftwood that would kindle the fire for her. These she drew together with a piece of rope, and she stood her breast knees on rocks for me to collect. As a teenager, I remembered coming home from school and heading over to see Nanny via the strand. Her activity was instantly recognisable, as she always started to gather at Moran's poles, and once I knew she was down there, I would race off to find her. All along the strand, her little piles of breast knees were laid, and like those clues laid down in the story of Hansel and Gretel. We would walk back together, and as we came to each pile, I gathered them up onto my shoulder and carried them home for her. All the time she was giving out to me about the weight I was carrying. It was only later I realised how frail she had become and how reliant she was starting to become on others. To her dying days, one of her only regrets was no longer being able to get down to the strand. And even 2 days before she died, then wheelchair bound, she mentioned going to Ryan's Shore again. So that's the first reading for you, and I'll be back with a couple more.